So, question of the day. What do you think unconscious language acquisition means? Today I wanted to talk about another study that I read. This time it was a paper written by this guy, Barry McLaughlin. I'm just going to say McLaughlin. He was criticizing Krashen's monitor model, which consequently was criticizing like the input hypothesis. And I wanted to kind of figure out like what somebody who's commonly cited as providing criticism, good criticism, and evidence for the input hypothesis, what do they have to say? Before I get into what I find bad about his criticism, let me first talk about something that I liked. McLaughlin seems to point out, due to the difference in environments of children and adults, that it may be the critical period doesn't exist. This is the idea that kids have something special in their brains which allows them to learn languages better and in different fundamental ways than adults. So also I want to point out this article was published in 1978, so the conditions under which it was published are very different than today, and plenty of ideas have developed and changed. However, like I said, the reason I wanted to get into this is because I see it cited as something that provides good evidence and criticism against the input hypothesis. So without further ado, let's get into it. This article starts out by providing two examples of incorrect sentences in German, and one he claims he knows is wrong by feel, and the other he claims he knows is wrong by rule. However, in the rule example he says, I think that something is wrong with the sentence, but to be sure, I have to go back to a rule I've tucked away. Later he goes on to say something like, in my own inspection, it's unclear whether I'm working on the basis of rule or feel. Like really in both cases, he feels that something is off, but since he applies a rule to one of them after the fact, this is processing by rule. What? Both examples you knew was wrong by feel, but due to the existence of a rule, it's processing by rule? Like what would happen if a new grammar rule was created? Suddenly, all the cases where someone knew something was off by feel are retroactively processing by rule examples? It doesn't make any sense. Further, in other research that I've talked about on this channel, specifically the one where French natives and non-natives were able to correctly identify incorrect sentences purely on feel, they were able to do this regardless of whether they were aware of a rule or not. He goes on to say, it's impossible to know whether subjects in these studies are operating on rule or feel based on this example he provides. So he says, the argument that adults experience a feel for, I'm going to butcher this word, for grammaticality rests on rather swampy empirical ground. So the swampy empirical ground he's talking about is a study where subjects identified incorrect sentences but were not able to identify the rule, and in that study they classified those as feel instead of rule. And so I guess he's implying that since people are less likely to be aware of harder rules, that, quote, it's not too surprising that there are fewer rule judgments and more feel judgments under those conditions. Are you kidding me? Unawareness of a rule for why something is wrong is exactly what processing by feel is. Again, it doesn't really make any sense. It's like he thinks if a grammar rule exists, no one is allowed to say they felt something was wrong. And kind of in an attempt to prove this point, he's trying to appeal to authority by citing a study that involves memory and talks about controlled and automatic memory, which essentially short-term memory is controlled memory that's updated rapidly but doesn't have a lot of capacity, and automatic memory is long-term memory, which is more concrete and has a larger capacity, accessed without intentional decisions, hence the name automatic. So he seems to imply in order for something to be acquired consciously or subconsciously, you first need to learn it consciously. He claims that this is why unconscious language acquisition is not true. That all language needs to be consciously studied in this controlled memory for it to get to the automatic memory. However, this is just a blatant misunderstanding of what unconscious language acquisition means. It doesn't mean language jumps straight into your subconscious, your automatic memory. It means you just can't force your brain to acquire something. It's kind of proving the opposite of what he's saying, actually. The decision to commit something to your automatic memory is not decided by you, it's decided by your subconscious brain or your unconscious brain. Fitting with the study he cites, what really happens is you consciously encounter some pattern over and over, and it's through a series of conscious encounters with that pattern, where, for example, you pick it out in your immersion and you understand its meaning. After you repeat that process, the pattern transitions into your automatic long-term memory. The distinction is that the subconscious or unconscious part is the process in which that transition to the automatic happens. Another thing that irks me about this article is that he writes things like, much of Krashen's evidence, however, is not evidence at all in any formal sense. Krashen's only shown you can talk about the distinction between learning and acquisition. And then he goes on to write shit like, of course, children use rules in learning their L1 without any citation or evidence, claiming we all use rules all the time to edit our sentences. Maybe he thinks that claiming he recalls in grade school he used grammar rules to edit sentences is sufficient evidence. It's not. It's just frustrating to read someone criticize the input hypothesis on the basis of evidence while they make strong claims for which they don't provide any evidence for. Anyways, my final thoughts on this paper are that the more and more linguistic stuff I read like this, the more and more I really start to dislike the obtuseness of linguistics academia. There's just so much in here using complex language to try to abstract, frankly, what I think is bullshit. And then you have people like Krashen, who's writing most of his stuff in easy to understand terms and language, making it really accessible. And people like this will criticize Krashen, claiming he's not precisely defining things. Nah, Krashen's just making his stuff accessible, is not an academic blowhard, and that's a good thing. Anyways, that's my thoughts on that. If you agree, if you disagree, let me know. I'm always interested in hearing what other people think. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.